In the summer of 1941, Germany destroyed 124 Soviet divisions, killed or captured 4 million Red Army soldiers, and advanced to within 65 miles of Moscow. By every metric, the Soviet Union should have collapsed in weeks. Yet by winter, Stalin fielded more troops than on the day the invasion began. Isolated facts do not explain this apparent impossibility. So how did an army gutted to the bone recover faster than it died? The answer is not valor, but a system one Germany never saw coming. 3,800,000 German troops crossed the Soviet border on June 22, 1941. Within weeks, the Wehrmacht's armored spearheads carved through the western USSR, capturing city after city, encircling entire Soviet armies, and shattering the Red Army's forward defenses. By the end of December, the invaders stood just 65 miles from Moscow's city center. The scale of destruction was mechanical, almost industrial. 124 Soviet rifle divisions were wiped off the map, over 4 million Red Army soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, and thousands of aircraft were lost before they could leave the ground. In the opening 3 days alone, nearly 2,000 Soviet planes were destroyed, most of them bombed in place. German columns advanced along a front stretching nearly 1,800 miles, pocketing entire Soviet armies at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. The losses defy conventional explanation. 3 million Soviet prisoners, almost the entire strength of the pre-war Red Army, marched into captivity. German officers sent back reports of victory parades in captured cities, confident that the campaign was all but over. Soviet command structures collapsed under the weight of defeat, with entire headquarters encircled and liquidated. In military terms, the Soviet state had lost the war by every standard metric. No modern army had ever survived such a blow. Yet, as the Wehrmacht prepared for the final assault on Moscow, new Soviet formations appeared on the horizon, replenished with men and weapons seemingly conjured from nowhere. The numbers demand an answer. How did a military system absorb 4 million casualties and still put more troops in the field by winter than it had at the start? The solution lies not in the courage of individuals, but in the machinery of a regime designed to survive catastrophe at any human cost. 4 million men lost in 6 months. By any military logic, the Red Army should have ceased to exist. Yet, as German officers congratulated each other on a war nearly won, the Soviet state activated a machinery designed for calamity. The 1939 Law on Universal Military Service was not a slogan but a system. It required every male citizen to serve, then placed him into a vast reserve pool, first and second categories, each man registered, tracked, and trained for recall. By June 1941, this pool numbered around 14 million. On June 22, 1941, as the Wehrmacht crossed the border, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet issued an immediate mobilization order. Every man born between 1905 and 1918 was summoned to report to his local Voyenkomat, the military commissariat network that functioned as the regime's human conveyor belt. Within 1 week, 5.3 million reservists were called up, including 500,000 officers. The scale dwarfed anything in German planning. Berlin's entire replacement system, built for a 10-week campaign, could muster just 321,000 men. Mobilization was not abstract. Trains packed with new conscripts rolled east, even as the front collapsed. The system did not depend on volunteers or morale. It relied on paperwork, quotas, and the threat of state power. By the end of 1941, nearly 14 million men had been cycled through this apparatus, with 5 million deployed to the front and the rest in training, logistics, or rear units. The Red Army did not survive by refusing to break. It survived because the state had engineered a mobilization machine capable of losing armies and raising new ones in a matter of weeks. In this system, human beings were not the limiting factor, only materiel. The next question was whether the factories could keep pace. 16 million civilians and over 1,500 factories vanished from the path of the German advance in less than 6 months. This was not chaos. It was a centrally coordinated evacuation, executed by the State Defense Committee, the GKO, under a series of classified decrees. The GKO's orders were clinical: dismantle every critical machine, load it onto rail wagons, and send it east beyond the reach of the Wehrmacht. Rail manifests from the Russian State Archive of the Economy show nearly 15,000 wagons dispatched, many carrying entire assembly lines, foundry presses, and teams of skilled workers. The human tide moved alongside the machinery, with entire factory communities uprooted and resettled in the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. The Kharkov tank plant number 183, responsible for the T-34, was loaded out in September 1941 as German armor closed in. Within 56 days of arrival at Nizhny Tagil, the plant was reassembled and producing tanks. Ural Vagon Zavod's logs record the first T-34s rolling off the new line by December, just as the Red Army situation was most desperate. By January, monthly output exceeded 350 tanks, a third of all Soviet armor production. The cost was staggering. Only a fraction of the original workforce survived the journey, and local civilians were pressed into forced labor to fill the gaps. German officers paraded through empty industrial shells in Ukraine and Belarus, convinced they had destroyed Soviet production. In reality, the material heart of the Red Army was already beating again, deeper in the interior, shielded by distance and winter. The logic of blitzkrieg never accounted for a state willing to uproot its own economy to survive. In Stalin's system, factories were more mobile than armies. A single coded telegram, sent from Tokyo in late October 1941, triggered one of the riskiest moves of the war. Richard Sorge, an undercover Soviet agent embedded in the German embassy, reported that Japan would not attack the Soviet Far East. This intelligence landed on Stalin's desk as German troops pressed to within artillery range of Moscow. Within days, Stavka issued orders to redeploy more than 200,000 veteran troops from Siberia and the Far East, divisions trained, equipped, and battle-tested, now loaded onto the Trans-Siberian Railway for a journey of nearly 5,000 kilometers west. Railway manifests from November and early December record a steady stream. Entire rifle divisions, mechanized corps, and artillery brigades moving in sealed trains, each unit assigned a precise timetable. The Trans-Siberian, still intact beyond the Urals, became a lifeline, with 12,000 wagons prioritized for military transport. The journey took nearly a month, with soldiers arriving at Moscow's outskirts as the first snow fell. By December 5th, these Siberian divisions stood in the trenches outside Moscow, their ranks hardened by years of frontier duty. They brought with them not just numbers, but experience in winter warfare and a discipline forged far from the chaos of the Western Front. When the Red Army launched its counteroffensive, these units formed the spearhead, driving the Germans back for the first time. The Wehrmacht, convinced the Soviet reserves were spent, now faced fresh, organized, and determined opposition. The arrival of the Siberian veterans was not a miracle, nor a matter of luck. It was a calculated gamble, made possible only by a regime willing to strip one frontier bare to save another. The Red Army's survival in 1941 depended not just on numbers or machines, but on the ability to redeploy the last reserves at the moment of maximum crisis. In this system, information, one telegram, could shift the balance of an entire war. A single directive could decide whether a man lived or died. In December 1941, Stavka Directive 1919 authorized the NKVD to form barrier troops, units whose job was not to fight the enemy, but to ensure no Soviet soldier left his post without orders. These detachments, numbering around 30,000, positioned themselves behind the front lines with instructions to shoot any unauthorized retreat. The logic was simple. If the enemy did not kill you, your own side might. Internal NKVD reports record over 1,000 executions for desertion in the first months of the war. Another 25,000 men were funneled into penal battalions, where survival rates were measured in weeks. Order number 227, issued in July 1942 but enforced retroactively, codified this system with 3 words: not one step back. The barrier troop network functioned as a human fence, preventing the collapse of entire sectors when panic set in. By some estimates, this mechanism retained 3 to 4% of the Red Army's frontline strength, tens of thousands of men who would otherwise have disappeared into the forests or surrendered. Discipline in Stalin's army was not a matter of morale or patriotism. It was enforced at gunpoint, with the full machinery of the state behind it. The survival of the Red Army in 1941 depended as much on fear as on any factory or mobilization order. In the Soviet system, retreat was engineered out of existence. German High Command entered the Soviet campaign with a 10-week timetable. Their planning documents, now stored in the Bundesarchiv, reveal a replacement pool of just 321,000 men, enough they believed to finish the campaign before winter. The assumption was that Soviet resistance would collapse after a handful of decisive battles, leaving no organized force behind the front. By January 1942, the Red Army was not only still fighting, but had grown larger than on the day of the invasion. Over 14 million men had been cycled through the Soviet system, with 5 million deployed at the front. At the same moment that German officers marched through deserted factories in Ukraine, Soviet production lines deep in the Urals were turning out hundreds of new tanks each month. The Siberian divisions, written off as immobile, arrived at Moscow in time to launch a counteroffensive. NKVD barrier troops and penal battalions, invisible in German intelligence estimates, kept entire sectors from disintegrating. The German plan failed not because of tactical errors or bad weather, but because it was calibrated for an enemy that did not exist. The Red Army's survival was not a product of chance or heroism, it was the result of a state machine built to absorb catastrophe and keep fighting, no matter the cost. The 10-week blitzkrieg collapsed against a system designed to outlast annihilation. Survival in 1941 was not inevitable. It was manufactured, at staggering human cost, by a regime willing to weaponize society itself. Today, as states again weigh security against individual lives, the Eastern Front stands as a clinical warning. Total mobilization solves defeat, but only by redefining what a nation can endure.